Okay. Uh, Andrzej,
Just give us a
I've not seen
second.
Andrzej
We
anymore.
need to wait once the.
Are we waiting something?
Yes. Thank you. We're waiting for for this screen. So good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's a real pleasure to open this webinar, MONDIACULT and the Future of Cultural Policy, Cultural Rights in a Global and Comparative Perspective. Today's discussion is jointly organized by the Cultural Heritage and the Arts Interest Group of the American Society of International Law and the Interest Group of International of Culture of the European Society of International Law. And I would like to warmly thank all of you for joining us from different parts of the globe. Let me also convey warm greetings from Shia Esterling, who is not able to be with us today. Our conversation builds on the MONDIACULT process, the global conferences on cultural policies convened by UNESCO since 1982. This meeting has brought culture firmly onto the international policy agenda, underlying its importance not only as a field of creative expression, but also as a public good, as a key dimension of sustainable development, social inclusion, and human rights protection. Against this background, today's webinar invites us to reflect on an increasingly important question: what is the role of cultural rights in shaping contemporary cultural policy? As culture becomes more visible international governance and development debates, it also raises complex questions about participation, diversity, access to culture, and the relationship between international norms and national policy framework.
Sí. Oye, me está marcando Ednita.
To
¿Por qué no
explore
haces
these
una
issues,
león Zoom?
we are very
Y que yo me
fortunate to
reporto
have
por
with
allá
us
inmediato.
distinguished group of speakers, each approaching these questions from different disciplinary and geographical perspectives. Let me briefly introduce them in order in which they will speak. Dr. Jorge Sanchez Cordero Davila is a leading authority on comparative law, director of the Mexican Center of Uniform Law, and the former vice president of International Academy of Comparative Law. He has served on the governing council of UNIDROIT and has represented Mexico in numerous international initiatives concerning legal governance of culture, including MONDIACULT Conference in Mexico City 2022. Beatriz Barreiro Carril is Associate Professor of International Law at Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid. She's member of Fribourg Observatory for Diversity and Cultural Rights and has served as an expert for UNESCO and the Kingdom of Spain. She's also co-editor of the forthcoming Oxford Commentary on the 2005 UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expressions. J.P. Singh is Distinguished University Professor at George Mason University and Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. He served as co-director of the Center for Human AI Innovation in Society at George Mason, with research spanning political economy, culture, cultural policy, trade, and technological policy. He has advised international organizations, including UNESCO, World Bank, and World Trade Organization. Alexandra Santaki is Professor of Law, Justice, and Governance at Brunel University, London, and United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. She is globally recognized for her work in human rights law, particularly in the areas of cultural rights, minority rights, and the rights of indigenous people. She served as the key expert for the MONDIACULT Summit in Barcelona last year. Before we begin, just a brief practical note. Today's session is being recorded, and we want to encourage you to post your questions also in chat and to use the Q&A panel. And also at the end, we will leave time towards for the final discussion. And now without further delay, let me turn to our first speaker, Don Jorge Sanchez Cordero. I would like to invite you to offer an overview of the MONDIACULT Conference Mexico in 2022 and its final declaration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres, for this presentation. And well, good afternoon here in Mexico City, and it is a great pleasure, and I'm very honored to try to share this Zoom meeting with my distinguished colleagues. I just wanted to introduce to your attention certain kind of reflections that what we have had in mind when my country convened a diplomatic conference here in Mexico City, in Mexico, in 2022, after perhaps 40 years that we didn't have MONDIACULT, and we tried to revitalize this important culture forum. I'm positive you have very clear in mind that in 1980 Mexico Declaration was paradigmatic. We changed the significance of culture from an Eurocentric approach to an anthropological approach, and then we try to give culture another dimension. Now, let me introduce what we have done, what we try to do in Mexico 2022 and its declaration. I would say that MONDIACULT Mexico 2022 has an intellectual significance. That was our aim to do so. Because we have to attire the attention of the international community that culture, culture was important, and it should be devoted to culture policy. It was both timely and necessary, in my point of view. And when we tried to organize this in 2022, what was the real challenges that we have to face? First of all, we have of course, digital transformation. That was one of the main issues. Secondly, geopolitical instability, environmental pressures, and a growing culture, and that's very worrisome, a growing culture homogenization. And then we produced the declaration, but the declaration is not merely a diplomatic text, I would say. It's an intellectual framework, to try to place culture in global governance. Then how to do it, that was our main concern. Then first, we try to introduce the idea and the notion that culture is a global public good. And what does this mean in practice? Well, we have realized that culture was only a domain, a natural domain in domestic policy. So to say, heritage protection, artistic promotion, or identity formation. Then we try to broaden this notion of culture, and to try to attire the attention of the international community that culture expressions, knowledge systems, and culture, heritage resources contribute to collective human flourishing beyond national borders. This was the aim of Mexico Declaration 2022. It is not only a problem of domestic realm, it is a problem of international dimension. Secondly, we have the reaffirmation of cultural diversity as a foundational principle of international cultural governance. And we do have to face these challenges, globalization, digital platforms, and the concentration, and this is very worrisome now, of media industries that is increasing the culture homogenization. And then the final declaration, that's why, reaffirms that cultural diversity must be actively cultivated through public policy. That involves ensuring access to cultural resources, supporting linguistic plurality, and enabling the participation of local communities and cultural practitioners in the decision-making processes. Third, the safeguarding of cultural heritage as a multidimensional responsibility. Culture, heritage, whether tangible or intangible, represents the historical memory of societies and accumulated knowledge of generations, monuments, archaeological sites, manuscripts, performing arts, traditional craftsmanship, oral traditions form part of an intricate system of cultural transmission. This is why we have to consider that Mexico Declaration 2022 tried to give culture a multidimensional responsibility to all the international community. Then, fourth, the integration of culture with sustainable development paradigms. Well, the Ursprung, the point of the pod was that in sustainable development, there are a lot of discussion considered only environmental and economic concerns. And then, little by little, it incorporated social and cultural dimensions. And then, this is to try to consider culture as a driver, an enabler of sustainable development. That was the aim of Declaration Mexico 2022. Fifth, the implications of digital transformation for cultural ecosystems. I want to state the obvious. Digital technologies have profoundly altered the modes through which culture is produced, disseminated, and experienced. But these digital platforms, we have to recognize they have a democratization process. But and this is worrisome, has created new asymmetries related to technological infrastructure, intellectual property, and algorithmic visibility. This tried to be faced with Declaration Mexico 2022. Sixth, the role of culture in fostering peace, dialogue, and social resilience. Beyond diplomacy, culture also plays a critical role within societies themselves. In contexts affected by polarization or conflict, culture initiatives can facilitate dialogue, preserve memory, and support process of recognition. And that's what we introduce, or we try to strengthen, to revitalize the notion of cultural rights in Mexico Declaration 2022. The significance, the intellectual significance of MONDIACULT Mexico 2022 lies not only in the principles articulated, but also in the broader paradigm it proposes. It invites the international community to reconsider culture policy as a central dimension of governance rather than a peripheral sector of public administration. As we consider the legacy of MONDIACULT Mexico 2022, we should view its final declaration not as a conclusion, rather than a strategic point of departures. The document offers a conceptual framework that can guide future research, policy development, and international cooperation. We are fully aware we were not naive. Declarations do not transform realities. Their impact depends upon culture actors to try to concrete these principles into public policies. Culture is not a peripheral aspect of human life. It is the very fabric through which societies articulate their values, preserve their memory, and imagine their future. In a rapidly changing world, culture offers continuity. In times of uncertainty, it offers meaning. And in moments of division, it offers the possibility of dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful overview of the works and the content of Final Declaration of 2022. And in a moment I will share also the link to the declaration in the chat. But now I would like to invite Beatriz Barreiro to comment on the MONDIACULT approach to and to the diversity and sustainable development, human cultural rights, and the need, as you called, institutional diverse way of addressing cultural policies. Thank you. Please, we cannot hear you. You are muted. We can see presentation, but the slide.
Yeah. So now you can hear me, right? And you can also see my presentation, I guess. Yes?
Correct. Yes, perfect.
Thank you very much, Ange. Thank you very much to all the organizers. I need to confess that I am a bit nervous sharing here this table with such outstanding speakers. It's a pleasure for me to be here sharing my thoughts about MONDIACULT 2025 in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, right? Because it's very linked with this idea of trying to make an independent objective in this context, right? So don't take me wrong, it's not that I am negative in relation with expectations of these instruments, but here my approach is more in the sense of pointing three challenges that I find from the lens of diversity. So the first issue I would like to address with you is what room for diverse ways of living in these documents. The second is why diversity in the context of cultural rights in this process as well. And the third addresses the diversity of cultural expressions, the fact that they need cultural policies with adequate administrative measures. Let's say we speak a lot about cultural policies for cultural rights, but as we have seen in the process of the Spanish Plan of Cultural Rights, and I have the occasion to coordinate a group on administrative measures and procedural issues, lots of the problems for cultural policies are found in these aspects that are not so substantive, are more procedural, and maybe they are not so, how to say, so appealing, right? But that they are really important. So my first concern concerning MONDIACULT linked with the Sustainable Development Goals, sorry, has to do with conceptual issues, but also, as you are seeing here in number 2, a concern of legal nature. The more and more I find that it's very common to think that since there is this agenda, all states agree on all the goals, right? And I am seeing, I am seeing very often that the attention is put so much in this agenda in the detriment of very important international human rights instruments that are more binding, right? Because we need to take into account that this agenda is a declaration of the General Assembly, right? So why I am saying this? Because if we go here to the conceptual level, in spite of all the declarations that we already have, I consider that there is no specific clear agreement on what sustainable development means. I relate this with the lack, during all these years, the lack of sole objective for culture in this agenda. My position is that since, in fact, if development would be considered taking into account the diverse ways of living, this would mean, of course, end up with the economic system we have, right? And this, of course, states, I think, are not really ready to accept. If we see here the general comment on the right to take part on cultural life, it is clear that culture includes methods of production and technology, so this is to say economy, right? And that culture shapes economy. So another, only for pointing some elements, right, that tell us that there is no clear consensus on what development is. We have this case that I think, Alexandra, you must have been working in this case because you were already the special rapporteur at that moment. I was impressed by this case, which is concerning the Maasai, that the special rapporteur on cultural rights asked UNESCO how is in trying to contribute to the respect of many human rights instruments, and the answer of UNESCO was that was in the language of sustainable development, right? So this is why I find a little tricky thinking in these terms of culture and development when still is not clear for many states and organizations what development really means. So in this sense, I am a little worried as well about the new concepts like global public goods when we still have difficulties to really agree on the topic of development, and particularly, as I said, when it may give the impression that things are going wonderful because we have this full agenda, but we need to remember the legal value of this agenda in comparison of many instruments of human rights that I think it would be useful to raise awareness around them together with the agenda, right? But not that because of this agenda we forget other instruments that are important and in relation to which states have binding obligations. My second concern is dealing with diversity in the context of these instruments of MONDIACULT is what diversity in the context of cultural rights in order that we don't end up essentializing identities. Let me explain myself. The documents of MONDIACULT, and not only the declaration, but the documents around speak a lot about public policy, so we need indicators for that. But I think there is still room and need for cultural policies of profiting of the clarifications made by the international organs of cultural rights, particularly the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, Alexandra, but as well the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Why I'm saying this? Because in these documents there are already things that are very clear that I am not so sure that in the public policies they are so clear. Particularly this fact that cultural rights mean not only the rights of the communities, but as well the individual rights of people within the communities, right? I think this is something very important because we need to remember, and I think that very often we forget, that if we have nowadays the framework of cultural rights that we have, is because it is clear that cultural rights includes the rights to participate in the cultural life of the community of individuals and the rights of these individuals to shape, to reshape, to live cultural practice and all these issues. So as you can see here, I like to say that if the principles of human rights are universality, interdependence, and indivisibility, probably we could say that the principles of cultural rights, at least I would like to say this, are cultural freedom, diversity, and participation. So I think that it is very important when public institutions design cultural policies around cultural rights, that they take this into account, right? For example, if there are measures concerning the representation of a specific cultural group, that these do not overshadow other aspects. By instance, the promotion of cultural freedom of individuals within those groups. And always remember that the main issue of cultural rights is creating the conditions for individuals and communities to be able to exercise these rights. Yes, this is what I wanted to say concerning this idea. And I think that in the declaration of MONDIACULT, these concepts are not so, let's say, so developed. By instance, we speak about artistic freedom, but somehow not in the broad context of cultural freedom, right? And this has to do as well when we speak about artistic freedom of women, by instance, that normally we see the framework of the cultural sectors when women work already in the industry of the cinema or the book or whatever, but maybe it's still room to work on conditions of many women that has not access to these wars, right? And I think this has to do more with this idea of cultural freedom, probably. And my third idea, and in order as well to be at the end of my presentation, has to do with the fact that cultural policies need adequate administrative measures. We have seen in the process of creating this plan of cultural rights of Spain that very often, by instance, in municipalities, cultural activities that fit very well in the frame of cultural rights are not possible to do because people working in municipalities, like doing interventions of the documents, of the accountability, procedural issues, do not know the framework of cultural rights, the possibilities of the Spanish constitution. And let's say that since nobody has done this before, has make a legal document allowing this activity, no one does it. They don't have incentives. But this doesn't mean that these activities are illegal or are contrary to the norms, to the administrative law. Is that what it lacks is like legal imagination, right? So, by instance, one of the things, as you can see here, the measure 139 of the Spanish Plan on Cultural Rights have to do with overcoming this obstacle by creating groups of experts, making databases of documents that interpret the legislation in favor of cultural rights, or making seminars for making this approach visible, this in favor of cultural rights, and, as I said before, allowing diverse ways of living culture and diverse ways of exercising cultural rights. So I think that this is all. I hope I was in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. And I would like to also to remind to the audience that in the next couple of days, the recording of this meeting, of this webinar, will be available at the YouTube channel of American Society of International Law. So, so you can also read with more carefully all the slides prepared by Beatrice. So to have more time and to read them and to maybe comment at YouTube. At YouTube. So now I would like to invite Professor Singh to tell us about the American approach to MONDIACULT, because US is not part of this process, and with a particular also approach to cultural industries. So I would like to really invite you to tell us about the history of the U.S. engagement, and also the present time of how the situation looks like today. Professor Singh, that the floor is yours now, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Professor Jakubowski and Professor Esterling, for inviting me to this panel. It's a distinguished panel, and I'm very honored to be here. And I'd also like to thank all the organizations that have organized it. I wondered if Professor Barrero may want to take down her presentation. You probably need to exit from it in the lowermost panel, because that's what we're seeing here right now. I'll try to build on what my colleagues have said. Dr. Sanchez concluded by saying that the declaration is not a conclusion, but a strategic departure for us to think about these issues. And then Professor Barrero very rightly pointed out the administrative challenge before us, and she used the word that it may lack a legal imagination. And so what I thought in terms of presenting the US perspective, or perspectives, because there can be several depending on which part of the US you look at, is to give sort of the de jure versus the de facto participation of the United States in cultural issues at UNESCO, specifically to do with MONDIACULT. I've been asked to speak on the US perspective, but I would add, building on the points that were conveyed before, I think of the 1982 MONDIACULT, the greatest contribution being introducing culture at a very fundamental level to the efforts of the global South and the developing world in terms of development perspectives, development issues, and the development imagination. It's forever changed because of what happened in 1982. And building on that, several international organizations, whether it's the UNDP, UNESCO, World Bank, and several others, began to incorporate culture and what many of us work on, issues of participatory development, became fundamental to how development would move forward. So in that sense, it's ironic that both the MDGs and SDGs did not speak to culture more explicitly, but that's probably because of the kind of issues that have been brought up, that culture is at once an aspirational term, but very slippery when it comes to framing a legal language and an administrative language around it. So let me speak to this de jure versus de facto participation of the United States. We know that the US will formally leave UNESCO in 2026, but has left UNESCO before, from 1984 to 2003, from 2018 to 2023. So US has a checkered history when it comes to UNESCO and not being able to be a full signatory to its debates. It did send a delegation to Mexico City, not Barcelona, last year. It signed on to the declaration, but there was a lot of hesitation in terms of what it would mean if it was put into practice. Many of the clauses, you can look at it and say those would not sit well in the United States under any kind of an administration, Democratic or Republican. We also know that US is only a signatory to a couple of the cultural conventions that came out of UNESCO. It signed on to the 1972 Cultural Convention, Cultural Heritage Convention, the 1952 Cultural Property and Armed Conflict, but very significantly, it did not sign on to the 2003 Intangible Cultural Heritage, or what followed after that, and what we've been talking about, the Convention on the Promotion and of Diversity of Cultural Expressions. So de jure, it sounds like it likes to be there, but not be there, not sign on to the conventions. But de facto, it's the big elephant in the room, whether it's in UNESCO or outside of it. The reactions in the declaration to artificial intelligence, the platforms, the intellectual property rights issues, etc., are not naming the United States, but that's the hegemon, the dominant player that must be dealt with in some way or the other. And it's probably the greatest influence, or the biggest, if I great supply some certain kind of normativity. So I'll use the word biggest influence on global culture, and three levels at which culture may be understood. Culture as everyday life that Dr. Sanchez was referring to in terms of the anthropological sense of culture. Culture as cultural expressions and artifacts in terms of distribution of those artifacts from the United States. And then if we understand culture as power, there too, the United States is that elephant in the room. So in that sense, we can go back and see how the US, even in a de jure kind of a capacity, has shaped cultural instruments in the past, even if it didn't sign on to them. One can trace the Convention on Intangible Expressions back to many of the Smithsonian debates when Latin American countries, specifically Bolivia, worked with the Museum of Folk Life, etc., the Smithsonian, to forward those debates. And later on, you see other countries champion them, specifically Japan, under D.G. Matsura's leadership, and that delivers on the Cultural Heritage Convention. US joins very late in those cultural diversity debates, but Article 20, which is the mutual supportiveness clause, which in a way it undoes the, if that's the term, it did undo the kind of the Vienna Conventions on what would be the superseding law. But Article 20 speaks to the mutual supportiveness clause in the Cultural Diversity Convention. In other words, debates going on in other international organizations must be mutually supportive. In 2005, there was a joint communique from the United States, China, Japan, Mexico, and Taiwan, and a couple of other countries at the WTO, saying that there cannot be a priori exclusion of culture from the debates in WTO. So one must keep in mind that while the MONDIACULT and other processes have been ongoing, US has shaped these cultural instruments, and their cultural instruments have been shaped in other places. And oftentimes, countries speak with double voices. To its credit, I would say that US speaks with one voice officially in terms of trying to exclude culture from these global debates. But countries like Mexico, Colombia, etc., whether it's the Ministry of Culture or the Ministry of Commerce or Trade speaking, they speak two totally different languages. So there's a lot of division among the countries on what culture means and whether it should be included or excluded. And that's where I think US's contribution to these cultural debates cannot be underestimated. So the question then is, as we move forward, can US, which is not part of UNESCO, how would it shape these debates? Can we, for example, have culture being declared as a global public goods, and the next set of development goals from the UN that come about, would they include culture? Well, the de jure answer is, of course they can. Yes, that can be included if we can work out the legal imagination, as Professor Barrero was referring to earlier. That can be included. But the question is, what would it mean in practice? In practice, it would mean that we must recognize that while US can, as a state actor, can kick its weight around in the world, it has considerably less influence in the world today than it did at the beginning of this century. Its contribution to UNESCO, even when it walks out, would be 8% of its budget, where it used to be about a quarter of its budget. And other players like China now play a far more dominant role in places like UNESCO than they did before. But in a de facto sense, we also must consider what does it mean to push back against the platform economies of the US. That is probably the biggest issue that we're confronted with, the platform economies that come with US tech giants, and how can we shape the future where those tech giants are de facto actors on the ground, whether it is Uganda or India, Vietnam, or other places. Here, I think UNESCO debates and the MONDIACULT debates so far, despite the fact that they speak to capacity building, etc., have been very reactionary. Make the algorithms more transparent. We need more of that. Let's try to regulate the algorithms. But that's a reactive position to the United States. The proactive position, especially from the European Union, in terms of what is it going to do in terms of gaining leadership in AI matters, especially when it comes to cultural rights, etc., has often been lacking. So I would say that as we try to frame a legal language around this, we're not going to just need a reactionary language where we have, but a proactive language of what can these countries do in terms of being significant players in the AI space. And that is going to take UNESCO to a place where it's very uncomfortable, a word that doesn't get used in UNESCO at all, the word innovation. If you look at what the United States talks about, it often talks about innovation, and it often uses a language of, as previous people were saying, a language of individual rights. It was opposed to the 1966 Convention of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. At that time, the Western world grouped against the USSR and its allies to oppose that convention, although it still exists. But the idea is important that Western democracies think of individual rights and think of intellectual property also mostly in individual terms. A proactive position that the EU, I think, has taken has been in places like geographical indicators, etc. That's something to build upon, because that's where culture comes in, and we have legal instruments that provide communities to safeguard their cultural property, because it's not just individual rights. Underlying those individual rights is the idea of whose property is it. Declaring it as a public good doesn't take away the issue of how is that property to be safeguarded. And I think the language of geographical indicators provides a way of us to think about those kinds of issues. So I'm going to cede some of my time here to then try to conclude that we can have in the future a pluralistic form of global governance in which the US remains a lead actor in this space without being in places like the United States, because it controls crucial cultural resources. But weak powers or mid-level powers will not always be beholden to the United States. So there's an opportunity here to shape the future, even though places like China and the US dominate these debates in terms of their platform economies. I've only referred to the US tech giants, but there are also tech giants from China right now, which also dominate in this space. So I'll end with the words of Thucydides, that there are great powers and leaders, but the non-leaders in this space may not always follow or suffer as they must. And so we are not just this 200 milos, 193 milos all around that will just suffer because China and the US begin to dominate this space. There are opportunities here. And I think the opportunity to be able to innovate and to be able to build on legal instruments, which building on what Professor Barrero was also saying, to think about not just a proactive, not just a reaction or a passive way of dealing with these dominant powers, but a very active way of dealing with those powers is where the weak and the middle powers come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these critical remarks. I think that there are many many points for discussion now, many and now I would like to invite Professor Santaki to give us your impression on and overall assessment of the Mondiacult process and also perhaps if you have if there will start some time also maybe on Barcelona Declaration on cultural rights maybe also
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have been attending and participating very actively in the MONDIACULT last year, and unfortunately, I didn't leave with a positive impression. There was a sour taste in my mouth. The good thing is that indeed, the MONDIACULT was a affirmation of multiculturalism. Of multilateralism. So not so much multiculturalism, but multilateralism for sure. A lot of states, were committed and they met. In this respect, states that are not committing in this process are isolated. And I think that the idea of Professor saying that, they're not there, but they still are the big powers. I think that in this respect, in cultural rights, they're not the big players anymore. They're absent. Nobody discusses the states as part of the process. If anything, Spain, I think, has become very recently a very important part. Mexico has always been a very important player in these debates, and of course Latin American states in general in the way forward. So multilateralism is what I take from that. However, I saw a lack of communication between the different bodies of the states. So the ministers of culture seemed a bit lost as to why we were here and what they were supposed to talk about, and they have not been briefed about what cultural rights mean, what we refer when we discuss cultural rights, or what was the reason of being there. So they had no understanding of the culture. Most of the meetings that we had were 5 ministers of culture coming on screen and saying how the culture of their state was important and should be protected. And this was completely, first of all, one culture. They wouldn't recognize that, there are a lot of cultures in their state that they should be protected. Secondly, they didn't understand what cultural rights are. So they were not talking about ways of life, as Professor Sanchez talked about, but they were talking about either artistic freedom or more often about cultural heritage. So there is a mismatch, and we heard a lot of discussions. Thank God there were small discussions of ministers of culture that were very embarrassing for 2025, coming and talking about how they should protect this element and that element of their national culture. So we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that the state bodies, the public bodies, understand what we mean when we talk about culture and what are their obligations. So states seem to sign and ratify UN conventions, but they don't understand what is the obligations that the state has undertaken, the legal obligations, as very correctly Professor Barrero talked about. This is also the distinction between UN and UNESCO. This is something that I saw also in the interactive dialogue that I had last week on conservation and cultural rights in the United Nations as the special rapporteur. States were talking again and again and again about UNESCO. So at best, I think that there have to be some training to diplomats as to, the distinction between UNESCO. UNESCO is there for the protection of cultures, as we know, and United Nations. United Nations is there for the protection to the right of cultures. So in this respect, I would expect that UNESCO would have sent the declaration before it was ready to the main body that deals with cultural rights, either to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights or to myself, to my mandate. Not personally, but to my mandate. And this never happened. So it seems that UNESCO believes that they know everything about cultural rights, and the declaration falls quite short of the existing standards on cultural rights. But let me just talk about MONDIACULT a little bit more. The MONDIACULT event also was very far away from Culturopolis, where all the NGOs were. So it had a very top-bottom approach. So, NGOs were not included, and it was just, as I said, the very well-known ministers of culture, and then maybe some institutional institutional representations, such as myself. But the other thing that I was really shocked by was that there was although the big NGOs or any NGO had big problems even attending and getting kind of badges, there was a whole panel that was created on AI, but that was sponsored and organized by Amazon. And so we see here that, this was, to me, that was shocking. And, it is shocking that we bring big companies that when we talk about AI, the whole debate is and should be about the bias. And I may disagree that it should not be about intellectual rights, but about the bias that AI has, about the lack of transparency, about control. And when we talk about innovation, we should push for non-prevailing voices and the innovation that these voices have, but we just continue to ignore them. And this was pretty bad. So when it comes down to the declaration, I was very surprised that when it talks about cultural rights, the declaration that came out of the event, I was very surprised that when it talks about cultural rights, it does not talk about in depth about discrimination. There is only one mention in the whole of the Declaration on Discrimination. So in any way, it doesn't take the cultural rights approach in any way. So it doesn't talk about non-discrimination. It does not talk about FPIC. It does talk about participation in a very fuzzy kind of way, but it doesn't talk about minorities having effective discrimination. Participation. It doesn't talk about FPIC for indigenous peoples. It doesn't talk about how development should be understood, not in economic ways, but in a ways that in a cultural manner and development, cultural development and what it means. It doesn't talk about how one size cannot fit all, and it doesn't talk about the sciences and the non-prevailing sciences that should back up any discussions about culture. It doesn't talk about conservation, it doesn't talk about creativity, and it doesn't talk about AI challenges. It only talks about AI as somehow being the new panacea, which is very much kind of contrary to scholarship and to United Nations standards. In this respect, it is good that in name, there was the UNESCO decided to focus on cultural rights, but by weakening the understanding of cultural rights, by not inviting real experts in cultural rights, and most certainly by excluding the actual people and NGOs that whose culture we seem to want to protect, I don't think that we are not helping cultural rights. Instead, I think that we use cultural rights as an excuse to continue a very top-down approach on culture. Way forward, I do believe that there is a space for culture as a standalone goal to whatever happens in the post-2030 agenda. But I am very worried that if this is how we discuss these issues in 2025, at the end of 2025, I'm very worried about what we agree on. And indeed, UNESCO has a lot to answer to, the Tanzanian example that Beatrice was talking about, but also other examples where UNESCO refuses to engage in real discussions on cultural rights is very problematic. So really, although it was very good to see a cultural rights plan by Spain, and very good to see the other states referring to cultural rights, in substance, I was quite concerned about the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these critical remarks and this feedback given to the entire process. And so I would like because I cannot see. I think that there's one question I think from Giovanni Carlo Bruno, so our dear colleague from European Society of International Law. And I can read this comment. So good evening and thank you for intervention. It is about CDG goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. Unfortunately, we live in time of war, where force is becoming more and more the language of international relations. What consequence do you see for cultural rights, in particular for the right to culture of peace? Thank you very much for your answer. And so I would like to ask you this, to all of you, this question also, because I was not present in Barcelona, but I read that on the first day, call for peace in Gaza rose loud applause, and there was much at the opening ceremony. I read this some in the news on the opening ceremony. So I think this question on the what is real the value so of MONDIACULT of this multilateral initiative when we talk about culture for peace. So I think this is like a very important question. And the second question I would like to ask to all of you, I think this is really what is the practical importance or the value of establishing culture as a standalone sustainable development goal? Because this I think that many people who are not very familiar with MONDIACULT, with governance of culture would ask, okay, so what is the practical value of that? What will really change if we put culture as a standalone sustainable goal? Thank you. So who will be the first to start? Who is willing to start on the peace and the standalone goal? Who would like to start? Who will be the first to start?
Should I do it, Andres, and then I'll set myself up for rapid fire from others. On the peace and conflict one, I think one of the very poignant things about UNESCO is that when you walk in, whatever the fights might be ongoing among the staff and the member states, etc., everyone can recite the preamble that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And the question from Giovanni Carlo Bruni is about, have our minds changed now? Having created UNESCO in 1947, we are right back to where we started. It came out of World War II, those debates that took place about how do we avoid a great war like that? And here we are in the midst of a lot of conflict. I've worked a lot on UNESCO, I've written a lot on UNESCO, and I can be very critical of it. And then you go present at places and then you say, what role does UNESCO play in this? Do we really need this organization? And I've seen, except for places like the Heritage Foundation in the United States, most people say, no, we need UNESCO. Richard Hoggett's very famous book on Master and its Servant says, we need UNESCO like we need King Lear to remind us of who we really are. We fight with each other, we fight wars, but we can be better than that. So as an aspiration, that's I think where UNESCO's chief contribution has been. But as people have pointed out, beyond aspirations when it comes to administrative instruments, that including the very goals it spouses, it falls short. I actually agree with Professor Santaki on most of the points that she brought up about, here it is sort of this global ministry of culture, which tells people what to do while telling them to be more participatory. That's very paradoxical, and that it has a very hard time even locating people in its field offices because most of them would rather stay in Paris. So and there are just us tensions within UNESCO which speak against what it's all about. But I think we do need those aspirations, and UNESCO has been the place to articulate those aspirations, and especially in a moment like this when I think that while the United States lacks a Ministry of Culture, most of the statements coming out of the United States government right now are cultural, and deeply problematic when they start speaking of civilizational erasure or who is to play a role within these cultural debates. So the United States is having a huge cultural debate while it walks out of a place like UNESCO. To the second question about culture as a standalone goal, I think I share the concern being revealed here that I don't know what that would mean. And especially because of what Professor Barrero and Professor Santaki pointed out, that when it comes to real debates, for example, about the Maasai people who are pastoralists and do not belong within national borders, what does it mean for them to have a cultural right? And so Tanzania and Kenya and Uganda and Rwanda, they've all signed on to the Cultural Diversity Convention, but on the other hand, are not able to reach domestic agreement on what are the rights of the pastoralist people when it comes to debates like this. So in that sense, maybe we need to break it down. What does it mean to participate? And who participates? UNESCO, unfortunately, being a UN organization, cannot speak to who is always excluded from those debates within domestic boundaries. So, what the United States position has been, and it is articulated very strongly throughout the administration, that people who come and speak for these cultural diversity conventions in Paris often do not follow those letters in their own domestic territories. They may be signatories, 148 as opposed to 2, but when you go within those borders, what is being done? What are the rights of Turkish immigrants in Germany right now? And what are the rights? The word xenophobia comes out of Greece. And right now, there's xenophobic forces that are in Greece. And I'm just being provocative here. So I think there's a whole lot of domestic debates that we need to have about what it means before we think about what could be crafted at the international level.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this rich and critical remarks. And I think the point between on this the divergence between the obligations of the undertaken on the international level and domestic policies, I think it's really important, and we can cite number of cases of when this problem has arisen, and not mentioning also the famous case of inscriptions of certain sites on the World Heritage List, like for instance Lake Bogoria. So with no participation, and we know also the judgments of the African Court of Human Rights and People's Rights. Yes, and I would like to invite other speakers to comment. Beatrice.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, because I think that maybe in order to be very fast, I was not clear enough with this relation between MONDIACULT and the objectives of the Agenda 2030, right? But in order to put a little of context, the idea is that cultural activists, cultural managers, artists, and so on are claiming for decades that this agenda and the one before, what was the name of, there was, sorry, I forgot the name of the other agenda, was similar to this one, to claim an independent space of culture, right? There are so many objectives of sustainable development, so many goals, right? The goals, so that one is culture. So all these people claim that this lack of visibility means that institutions, states do not put enough attention, the attention that culture deserves. And I agree. This is to say that during many years, cultural managers and artists are trying to prove, by instance, how their work contributes to the economy of their countries. That, of course, is true, and how this and how that. And at the end, there is no this recognition, which is it's a relation between this symbolic recognition of a specific objective and the link with the fact that there are not enough budget for culture, enough, as Alexandra was saying, all the issues of culture, right, are not generally respected. If we speak about indigenous rights, I don't want to be here so vague, but I rather said that the most part of indigenous people's rights, cultural rights in the world are not respected, right? So there is a lack of a generalized lack of respect to cultural rights. So at the end, it's clear for all these groups that we are tired of measuring culture, how culture contributes to other things. Culture is a value in itself and needs to be promoted and protected, right? And the fact, of course, that there is not a goal, taking into account this context where all these people are trying to fight for it, is a bad symptom, right? It's a bad symptom, and I think it would be good, and it would visibilize the importance of culture, and it would make very probably governments put pressures on them to pay more attention also economically, right? And my point here was that one of the reasons, not because we speculate why this happens, this is only my theory, right? But I think it may have to do with the fact that culture, if we see how culture is defined in all the instruments coming from basically the MONDIACULT declaration on 1982, that as other people said here, Alexandra specifically, right? I think if we compare this new declaration with the original one, I think that conceptually there is such a distance in the, potential, in the clearness of the concepts, in the transformative power, right? If we compare both. But what I was trying to say here is that having an objective, of course, would visibilize this. And I think since we have already, as I was saying, so many good definitions, not close definitions, right? We know about what culture is in this declaration, which is such a beautiful definition, right? Then in the general comments, then in all the work of the special rapporteurs, and all, if you see all the quasi-jurisprudence of the special rapporteur of cultural rights, that we can see many things. So what we are seeing is that culture means respecting cultural rights, cultural diversity. Culture means and would mean, if we recognize it as such, that states would need to adopt systems of living together completely different to the model we have now, based on, let's say, right, very broadly, capitalism as a way of living and free market, right? It's not so much now for some leaders, but anyway. So, and I think this may be one of the reasons that, of course, when states make these declarations, of course, they know these documents, they have advices, and they know this value, and it's a very powerful tool. This is my theory. And then for concerning the other question of cultural rights and peace, in fact, I think maybe we can all agree that finally conflicts has a lot to do with identities, with not understanding the other, not seeing the common humanity in the other, and all these issues, right? So it's completely linked, cultural rights to peace. Even to the extent that I think that if in a world that would respect and promote cultural rights in the ideal way, right, that all these wonderful documents of United Nations tell us, there would not be wars, right? So what I wanted to say here is that it's very important here, the interdependence of human rights. I think it would be important when the mechanisms that try to supervise how states respect these rights to put all this in relations, right? Because it's very, how to say, disappointing, right? Seeing states that promote wars and then in other forums said that respects cultural rights because they made this, they made that, right? So I think that there should be more attention to interdependence. But here I would like to say, and I finish with this, Oriange, but what I wanted to say is that we need to be very careful when with which kind of theories we use, because I am seeing that, how to say that, so many policies are based on theories of different disciplines, right? And sometimes these theories sometimes linked to activism or social movements or cultural movements, sometimes they are coincident with cultural rights and cultural rights within international human rights, but sometimes not necessarily, in the sense that maybe they put emphasis in an issue in detriment with another, by instance, and taking into account particular context and particular lives of individuals, this can be detriment. So I'm not saying that in all cases this is, how to say, linked with peace and war, but that we need to be careful on how we use the meaning of culture, and particular now that we have this frame of cultural rights, to take care very well of the meaning of cultural rights, and I repeat, based on the instruments, particularly on the ones of the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights. We have there a source of inspiration and of designing of public policies, right? So how to say, I am in favor of using the language of human rights, right? Because sometimes we use other languages for defending the cause of cultural rights, and cultural rights has its own independent language, which is the language of international human rights.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Thank you. And I see the the raised hand of Alexandra. So, yes, please.
Yes, thank you. So I think that cultural rights are the core rights when it comes to today and crisis and conflicts. So the Palestinians were, the moment that they, the war started in Gaza, I happened to be in the US, they were completely dehumanized. So their cultures, there were actually media all over in the US saying that they are exactly the same as ISIS. In Europe, it was exactly the same, that they were talking about, the Palestinians as terrorists and, Muslim kind of, in very kind of bad. So this dehumanization, which basically is the denial of the right of everyone to their culture, because their culture is suddenly seen as something bad, is very much at the core of human rights, of cultural rights. Also at the core of cultural rights is this idea of diversity, not seeing everybody else as the enemy, but trying to understand where they're coming from, what is their past, and what are their vision for the future. So one of the main reasons at the moment that we, are talking about the US and Israel attack on Iran is, this idea that the right to decide on their future, has been taken away and is being taken away. But also this idea on whether Iranian women should, it's the culture, the society that should decide how they're going to be dressed and what kind of rights they have, and etc. It's also very much a cultural rights discussion, and we don't frame it enough, I think, in terms of cultural rights. So the limits that maybe cultural rights should have, and who decides on these issues. Is it the women? Is it the society? Is it the state? Is it somebody external that is going to come, the feminists, the Western feminists, to go and tell, the Iranian women that this is how they should be dressed? So all these are parts of the cultural rights. And when we do have wars, the violation and the destruction, the voluntary, on purpose destruction of cultural heritage is certainly like part of the cultural rights approach, like the Al Mahdi case has shown us. So I think that, you know, when it comes to time of war and time of crisis, we have to look back and we have to see how cultural rights being denied has moved to war. I'm going to remind you that Russia, the reason why they attacked Ukraine was that Ukrainian was not a real culture, and it was about the Russian culture that really. So all this, you know, is part of cultural rights, the first issue. The second issue is about standalone development goal, exactly what Beatrice said. The standalone development goal, the cultural standalone development goal is going to give us goals and targets, and is going to make the states focus on what they have to do and how they have to do it. So this is going to be targets for the next 10 years that the states will have to stop and listen. So that's why it is very important. And it cannot happen through the other goals because, for example, like equality between men and women, you know, it was a standalone goal, but it also happened through other goals. So in the same way, culture, the protection of culture, should be a standalone goal, but also through the other goals or whatever we want to call them after 2030. So I think that this is why it is very important. And I think that the Tanzanian issue is very interesting because it's very interesting that I had this discussion with the ambassador of Tanzania in Geneva just this morning, because I did refer in my conservation report to Tanzania, and they were you know, they wanted to talk to me. UNESCO, states are very eager to talk about UNESCO, and I said in my talk, at best because they don't know the difference between UNESCO and UN, but at worst because UNESCO does not have a monitoring process, does not talk about the rights of individuals and groups within the state, but does not have space for NGOs, real NGOs. So it's very interesting that Tanzania, it is very well known that the Masai is being violated, like Professor Singh said, like Beatrice said, it is very clear. Yet Tanzania at the moment is a member state in the committee on the World Heritage Committee. There is no real monitoring way forward. So what I am arguing for is to ensure that UNESCO in its works takes into account the UN standards of cultural rights, not the standards they feel that cultural rights are about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jorge would like to comment on that.
Well, I think this is this is a very polemic, the very polemic issue. Of course, and I'm going to try to put an example that perhaps would be helpful to try to put more things in perspective. We do have in human rights, for instance, of course, in cultural rights. We have the European perspective. The European perspective did not give satisfactory answers, for instance, to our region. And then we follow another path with the Inter-American Human Rights Court, for instance. And this is we have to pay attention how societies work. That is the main issue. I mean, Europeans, they think very individualistic. That is the scheme, and this is the deep-rooted tradition in Europe. Whereas in our region, this is that we do have other cultural actors in moving in the Americas, and this to say, for instance, that we cited the indigenous communities, and then we introduced, for instance, collective rights. that is, so to say, very strange to the European narrative, for instance. And then, well, the Inter-American Human Rights Court framed a new cultural model, I would say, that was reproduced in our region, mostly, for instance, in my country, in Mexico. Then we have to take this also into consideration, that we are talking about diversity. And diversity is very important to take it into consideration. We have different approaches in the world, in the different societies. And I want to introduce, for instance, the very polemic debate between the human rights universalism, for instance, and cultural relativism, for instance. I think that we have to take it quite clear what we are talking about. I mean, to try to bring a universal human rights narrative to our societies, that they react differently and they have different foundations, grounds, and then to try to bring these narratives to our societies is, I think, in my perspective, is a methodological wrong. Then we have to take diversity very seriously, and if you, and I'm positive you have already read about the adjudications of the Inter-American Human Rights Court, you can realize more or less how we are moving from, and we're going get rid of the European approach, and we are going to try to frame another approach with collective rights, for instance, or even diffuse rights, very unknown for Europeans. But these kind of new notions give correct answers to our society, to our societies, for instance. That's what we have to take also into consideration. And I think in my point of view, one of the main, I mean, we are not talking, and we cannot talk about dominant cultures, for instance. I mean, this is also methodological incorrect in my point of view. I mean, we have to take it in a whole perspective, how really the societies work, how are the foundational principles of the societies, so that we could more or less to try to bring a universal narrative, yes, but taking also into account what we're talking about, different, that we're talking about very different, and this is a clear different specificity in what we are talking about. That's what it's about. Then, of course, we do believe in human rights. For instance, in my country, we're moving from one part to another, but we have to take care about indigenous communities. They think very differently as us, very differently. And well, how do they react? How do they work? And then we can have a good dialogue between one part of the narrative and the other part, and then we can be more productive in my point of view. That is what I want to introduce. Of course, in UNESCO, we have to have clear in mind, in my point of view, how the international Charter order is scaffolded. I mean, of course, we have to realize that the origin of UNESCO, well, I mean, it was 1945. Europe was in ruins. And then, well, how to introduce this new concept of culture order in a world that was seeking for guidance, I would say, And UNESCO has given us guidance in these very early stages of the UNESCO. We do have our problems now at the outset of the 21st century. How can we imagine, for instance, that culture, the exercise of cultural rights in digital ecosystems, for instance? This is one of the main challenges of our societies nowadays. And then, of course, we cannot compare UNESCO 1945 with UNESCO 2026. We are speaking of another world, of course. And we try to scaffold the international order. That is also very challenging now, but it is not unsurmountable, I would say. But we have very clear, and that's why Mexico Declaration 2022 was trying to introduce the polemic about considering culture as a universal public good, for instance. It's one of the exercises, intellectual exercises, that we wanted to introduce in the diplomatic conference in Mexico City in 2022. And to try to finish, I want to introduce about culture of peace. This is my answer. Pax Cultura. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and also for commenting on this important aspect today. Today we discuss what is the future also of international law of culture. So considering all this new, because Jorge, you mentioned like the development of the UNESCO system from 1945, and today concerning the new situation, or maybe not the new, but about as a board of peace and all these initiatives concerning the future of the UN and this and the system of the United Nations. But I think we don't have enough time to discuss today, but because as we know, we need to conclude in 2 minutes. So I would like to thank you all our speakers for the insightful contributions, and all participants for joining us today from different parts of the world. This has been a rich and timely discussion, and we hope that we encourage further reflection on the place of cultural rights in present day and the future international law of culture. And as already mentioned, a recording of today's webinar will be available on the American Society of International Law YouTube channel, so hopefully by the end of this week. And thank you again, and wish you a very good day, afternoon, or evening, whatever you are joining us from. Thank you once again.